I want to draw your attention to a turning point in history. I believe that from a purely military perspective, it signaled the end of the medieval era. It brought into focus some of the trends that were beginning to emerge that would continue for the next 500 years. This turning point was the Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415. This battle was a small part of the 100 Years' War between England and France. King Henry V of England had invaded with a small army and some unrealistic goals. After a few months of campaigning and some very modest success, he resolved to head for English Calais and then back across the Channel. As the English approached Calais, the French army finally caught up with them and pursued them north. By this point, the English were exhausted, and the French easily overtook them, placing themselves between the English army and the coast. The English were now cut off, stuck in enemy territory with winter fast approaching. This was a bad position, which was just going to deteriorate with every passing day. Let's take a moment to look at the relative strength of these two armies. The French army had around 2,400 cavalry, 7,600 heavy infantry, 4,000 archers, and 1,500 crossbowmen. The English army had no cavalry, 1,000 heavy infantry, 5,000 archers, and no crossbowmen. Let me just say here that these numbers are hotly debated. I spent some time looking into some of the various arguments, and in my opinion, these numbers make the most sense, but take that with a grain of salt. Historians who have devoted their entire careers to this subject have, in a way, thrown up their hands in frustration. This is what we know with certainty. We know what kinds of troops made up each army, and we know that the English were significantly outnumbered. So, the English and the French squared off across a muddy field. This field was flanked on both sides by tree lines. The English were to the south, English territory was to the north, and between them stood the French. The French arrayed themselves in 3 lines of battle. The lines were mixed, but most of their cavalry was placed forward on the wings, while most of their archers were held back in the 3rd line. The English, being outnumbered, arrayed themselves in 1 line. They placed all of their heavy infantry in the middle, with archers on the wings. They also concealed some archers in the woods, on both sides of the field. The archers all deployed defensive wooden stakes in front of them, which were supposed to deter any direct charge and funnel enemies towards the heavy infantry in the middle. They were otherwise undefended. The English had an unusual problem. Look at the makeup of this army. It's idiotic, right? They didn't do this on purpose. At the beginning of the campaign, the army was double this size, with normal proportions, but casualties and attrition left them with this lopsided arrangement. So the two armies formed up. Neither wanted to make the first move. For the French, they had several thousand men who had fallen behind during the march. These men would be trickling in over the next few days. Plus, they were well supplied, they could afford to wait. For the English, they had created this little makeshift defensive position for themselves that they didn't want to leave. But some accounts say that the English were out of food, which put a ticking clock on their situation. After a lengthy standoff, the English moved first. Their archers dismantled their defensive wooden stakes and carried them forward as the whole army advanced. The French, still content to wait, just watched this happen. This may have been a mistake, but we will never know. The English regrouped at a new forward position and reconstructed their makeshift defenses. This new position put the French within the extreme range of the English longbow. Before too long, the French started to get pelted by a few arrows. The French were ordered to advance. The men on the front lines were immediately hit with unexpectedly heavy arrow fire, which caused some of the units to try to pull back, while others continued to advance. This caused a big mess, and the battle was only minutes old. The French cavalry was not discouraged, and charged heroically into the arrow fire. They headed straight for the English archers, who appeared to be in exposed positions. As they advanced, the English hit them with volley after volley, but soon enough the French reached the English line. The defensive wooden stakes did their job, and the first group of cavalry to reach the archers found themselves impaled on the spikes. Apparently this caused the horses further back to panic, and many of them now refused to charge the archers. There was some isolated hand-to-hand fighting, but for the most part the cavalry just darted back and forth in front of the English longbowmen. After failing to regroup and mount a second charge, the French cavalry turned to withdraw. As they did this, chaos started to spread, and the withdrawal turned into a full-blown rout. All order broke down, and the French cavalry uncontrollably crashed into their own heavy infantry, causing general pandemonium. Still under fire, the French infantry from the 1st and 2nd lines regrouped, and then advanced. Remember that the field was muddy, and it was now completely tore up after that failed cavalry charge. The infantry was weighed down in full armor, and had serious difficulty navigating in the mud. They advanced at a snail's pace, and the entire time the English longbowmen were doing their thing. When they finally reached the English line, they were totally exhausted, but nevertheless charged the English center. The French infantry still significantly outnumbered the English, and the English were forced to slowly give ground. As you can imagine, the English archers had a field day with the stationary French infantry at close range. Despite all of this punishment, the French troops continued to gain ground. This fighting continued for 3 hours, and it was intense. As the English longbowmen began to run out of arrows, they picked up swords and went to reinforce the heavy infantry. The English king personally intervened and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. He actually took an axe blow to the helmet. The English were fighting for their lives. After hours of brutal fighting, a couple of French units broke and pulled back. The English were on their toes and immediately poured into the gap in the French lines. The commanders of the French infantry were all dead. Leaderless, individual French units began to surrender to the English en masse. The remaining units broke and fled. The English now had thousands of prisoners, but still faced the uncommitted French third line. They sent out a messenger, saying something to the effect of "withdraw or be destroyed." The English then set about barbarically slaughtering thousands of their prisoners. Why did they do this? Maybe it was supposed to intimidate the remaining French. Maybe they didn't have enough men to guard the prisoners and fight at the same time. Maybe they were overcome with simple bloodlust. Regardless, the French third line got the message and quietly withdrew from the field. The battle was now over, and it was a stunning English victory. The French lost somewhere around 8,000 men. The English lost only 100. So what did this mean for world history? Why was this such a big turning point? This battle crystallized a couple of trends that would come to redefine European warfare. First, the rise of projectile weapons. Gunpowder was around, but its military usage was not yet fully realized. Agincourt gave us a peek at the world to come. Short bows, which were common before the 15th century, fired arrows that would bounce off of most heavy armor. Longbows, which the English used at Agincourt, had an extremely long range and had the power to punch through plate mail. This improvement in projectile weapons was a development that was going to continue, and would only become more pronounced with the widespread introduction of the flintlock musket some years later. Second, heavy armor just wasn't what it used to be. When heavy infantry couldn't move fast enough to engage with longbowmen or musketmen, they were transforming themselves into nothing more than slowly moving targets. Going forward, heavy infantry had to be paired with longbowmen or musketmen in order to be effective. Third, the death of the cavalry charge. Beginning with Agincourt, this could no longer be every army's trump card. Obviously, mounted troops would be widely used and situationally effective for centuries, but look at what happened here. The English turned a frontal attack into a rout and barely even had to come face to face with the enemy. This was new. Cavalry could not be relied on as an army's all-purpose sledgehammer anymore. Europe would spend the next couple of centuries adapting to this new paradigm. I have a Patreon page. If you're interested in donating, head on over to patreon.com/Historia Civilis. It's the best way to see my videos before I release them to the general public, if you're into that sort of thing.